They told me I was being too cautious and that my safety concerns were hurting productivity, but when they escorted me out of the manufacturing plant that cold Tuesday morning after 8 years of dedicated service, I knew they were making the biggest mistake of their corporate lives. My name is David Chen, and I was the safety director at Meridian Industrial Manufacturing, a mid-sized plant that produced automotive components for some of the biggest car manufacturers in the country. I didn't just do my job, I lived it, breathing life into safety protocols that had prevented countless injuries and saved the company millions in potential liability. But none of that mattered to the new plant manager, Richard Koslow, who'd been brought in 6 months earlier with a mandate to cut costs and boost production numbers at any cost. He saw safety regulations as inconvenient obstacles, and he saw me as the annoying voice of reason standing between him and his quarterly bonus. The tension had been building for months, ever since Richard started his campaign to undermine every safety measure ID implemented. He'd hold production meetings without inviting me, then act surprised when I raised concerns about decisions that violated OSHA regulations. He encouraged floor supervisors to skip safety briefings to save time, implying that workers could just use common sense instead of following proper lockout-tagout procedures. When I documented a near-miss incident where a worker almost lost 3 fingers because a machine guard had been removed to speed up a changeover, Richard accused me of exaggerating and creating unnecessary paperwork. I started keeping meticulous records of every violation, every safety bypass, every time Richard prioritized speed over worker protection, because I could see where this was heading and I knew I needed to protect myself and the workers who depended on me. The final straw came during a particularly brutal production push when we were behind on a major contract. Richard had authorized mandatory overtime, pushing some workers to 70-hour weeks, operating heavy machinery while exhausted. I walked the floor at 2 in the morning and found multiple safety violations that made my blood run cold. Emergency exits blocked by material carts, fire extinguishers that hadn't been inspected in 8 months, a chemical spill in the mixing area that hadn't been properly cleaned, and workers operating forklifts who were so tired they could barely keep their eyes open. I immediately shut down 3 production lines and sent workers home, citing imminent danger provisions that gave me the authority to halt operations when lives were at risk. Richard was in my office within 20 minutes, his face purple with rage, screaming about the money we were losing and how ID just cost him his credibility with corporate headquarters. I stood my ground, calmly explaining that dead workers cost a lot more than delayed shipments, and that OSHA fines for the violations ID documented could run into hundreds of thousands of dollars. Richard went quiet, which should have been my first warning, because a man like him didn't go quiet unless he was planning something. He told me to go home and get some rest, that we'd discuss it in the morning with cooler heads. I should have known better. The next day, I arrived to find HR waiting in the parking lot with a security guard. They told me my position was being eliminated as part of a restructuring initiative and that my duties would be absorbed by the operations team, which was corporate speak for Richard would now oversee his own safety compliance, letting the fox guard the henhouse. They gave me 30 minutes to clean out my desk while a security guard watched, as if I was some kind of criminal, and then they walked me out the front door in full view of the morning shift arriving for work. The humiliation burned, but what hurt more was knowing those workers were now at the mercy of a man who saw them as disposable production units rather than human beings with families who needed them to come home safely every night. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time, watching the plant operate, seeing the smokestacks pumping, hearing the industrial sounds that had been the soundtrack of my professional life for nearly a decade. That's when I made my decision. I wasn't going to just walk away and let Richard create a disaster waiting to happen. I was going to make sure that every single violation ID documented, every corner head cut, every regulation head broken came to light in a way he couldn't ignore, deny, or cover up. I drove home and pulled out my files, Years of documentation that ID backed up to personal drives precisely because ID learned early in my career that companies don't always preserve evidence that makes them look bad. I had photographs of violations, time-stamped emails where Richard explicitly ordered supervisors to bypass safety protocols, incident reports that had been mysteriously lost in the company system but that ID kept copies of, maintenance records showing equipment that was operating well past its safe lifespan, and documentation of worker complaints that had been ignored. I organized everything into a comprehensive dossier that painted a damning picture of systemic safety failures and deliberate regulatory violations. But I knew that just sending this to corporate HR would result in it being buried, sanitized, or explained away. Richard had allies in the corporate structure who were impressed by his production numbers and didn't ask too many questions about how he achieved them. I needed to go higher, to someone who couldn't afford to ignore what ID found, someone whose job was specifically to prevent exactly the kind of disaster Richard was creating. I contacted OSHA through their confidential reporting system, providing my detailed documentation and explaining that ID had been terminated in retaliation for attempting to enforce safety regulations. I gave them dates, times, specific violations, and evidence that the company was aware of the problems but chose to prioritize production over compliance. I also reached out to the State Labor Board and, because some of our violations involved environmental regulations related to chemical handling, I contacted the EPA as well. I wasn't just reporting Richard, I was building a case that would require a multi-agency response, something too big for the company to sweep under the rug with their usual combination of lawyers and public relations spin. Then I waited, because I knew that government agencies don't move quickly, but when they do move, they move with authority that private companies can't ignore or intimidate. 6 weeks went by and I heard nothing, which was agonizing because I kept thinking about those workers and wondering if someone had been hurt or killed while I was waiting for bureaucracy to do its job. ID found a new position at a smaller company that actually valued safety professionals, but every night I checked the news and industry reports, half expecting to see a headline about a tragedy at Meridian. Then one morning, my phone rang from an unknown number. It was an OSHA inspector named Margaret Reeves, and she told me they'd reviewed my documentation and found sufficient cause to conduct a surprise comprehensive safety audit of the entire Meridian facility. She asked if I'd be willing to serve as a consultant during the inspection, using my knowledge of the facility to help them identify areas of concern. I agreed immediately, feeling a surge of anticipation that I hadn't experienced since the day I was escorted out. The audit was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and OSHA doesn't give advance notice for surprise inspections triggered by serious complaints. Margaret told me to meet them at a location near the plant at 6 in the morning, before the day shift started. I barely slept the night before, running through the plant layout in my mind, thinking about all the violations that were probably still occurring because Richard thought had neutralized the only person who would hold him accountable. When I arrived at the meeting point, there were 3 OSHA inspectors, 2 EPA representatives, and someone from the State Labor Board. They had my documentation and had done their preliminary review, and Margaret told me this was one of the most comprehensive complaint packages she'd seen in 15 years of inspections. We arrived at the plant at 6:30, and I watched from the parking lot as they presented their credentials at the front desk and informed the stunned receptionist that they were conducting an immediate facility-wide inspection. Richard was called down from his office, and I wish I could have seen his face when he realized what was happening. The inspection team split up, covering every area of the plant systematically, and I accompanied them as a technical consultant, pointing out specific areas where I knew violations existed. We found everything ID documented and more, because in the 6 weeks since my termination, Richard had gotten even more reckless. Machine guards that should have been replaced were still missing, workers were operating equipment without proper training certifications, hazardous materials were being stored in violation of multiple regulations, and the emergency response plans ID developed had been literally thrown in the trash. One inspector found a journal entry from a floor supervisor documenting that Richard had ordered him to falsify safety training records to save time, which was a federal violation that carried criminal penalties. The inspection took 2 full days, and by the end of the first day, OSHA had issued an immediate shutdown order for 3 production lines due to imminent danger conditions. By the end of the second day, they'd cited the company for over 70 serious violations, 12 willful violations, and 3 egregious violations that came with the maximum penalties. The total fines exceeded $800,000, but the financial damage was just the beginning. The shutdown order meant the plant couldn't fulfill its contracts, resulting in penalty clauses with customers that would cost millions. Several major automotive clients launched their own audits of Meridian's safety practices and began quietly moving their business to competitors because they couldn't risk being associated with a supplier that had such catastrophic compliance failures. The corporate headquarters response was swift and brutal. Richard was terminated within 48 hours, not with a quiet restructuring announcement, but with a very public statement that had been fired for cause due to safety violations and regulatory noncompliance. The company's general counsel made it clear in internal communications that Richard's actions were unauthorized and contrary to company policy, legally distancing the corporation from his decisions while throwing him completely under the bus. Several supervisors who'd followed his orders to bypass safety protocols were also terminated or demoted. The company hired an outside safety consulting firm to conduct a comprehensive review and implement new protocols, and they reached out to me through their attorneys to discuss a potential settlement for wrongful termination and retaliation. I met with their lawyers in a conference room that probably cost more per hour than most workers made in a week, and they offered me a settlement that included back pay, a substantial financial payment, and a glowing reference letter. But I wasn't interested in just taking the money and signing a non-disclosure agreement. I told them I'd consider their offer if they agreed to specific conditions, including reinstating my position with a direct reporting line to corporate rather than plant management, implementing every safety recommendation in the OSHA report, establishing a whistleblower protection policy that would prevent retaliation against employees who reported safety concerns, and creating a workers' safety committee with real authority to halt production when necessary. I also demanded that they fund safety training scholarships in my name for workers who wanted to become certified safety professionals, turning my experience into something that would benefit the entire industry. They agreed to everything, probably because their lawyers calculated that the cost of my demands was far less than the continued regulatory scrutiny, customer defections, and reputational damage they'd face if I went public with my story. I returned to Meridian not as the same safety director who'd been humiliated and escorted out, but as the vice president of safety and compliance with expanded authority and resources. The workers who'd watched me get fired now saw me return vindicated, and the message was clear to everyone in the organization that safety wasn't optional and that speaking truth to power would be protected rather than punished. I walked through the plant on my first day back, and workers came up to shake my hand, thanking me for not abandoning them even after the company tried to silence me. Richard, meanwhile, found that his reputation in the industry was destroyed beyond repair. Word spread quickly about what had happened at Meridian, and no reputable manufacturing company would touch him with a 10-foot pole. I heard through industry contacts that had been forced to leave manufacturing entirely, taking a sales position in an unrelated field where his production numbers couldn't endanger anyone's life. The supervisors who'd followed his orders and falsified records faced their own consequences, with some losing their professional certifications and others finding it impossible to get hired in positions of responsibility. The message rippled through the entire industry that safety violations would be taken seriously and that managers who prioritized short-term profits over worker protection would pay a price that went far beyond regulatory fines. The most satisfying moment came 6 months after I returned, when Meridian won a National Safety Award for our improved protocols and zero lost time incidents. I stood on stage accepting the award, and in my speech, I talked about the importance of creating workplace cultures where safety professionals are empowered rather than punished, where workers feel safe reporting hazards without fear of retaliation, and where leadership understands that protecting people is the foundation of sustainable productivity. I didn't mention Richard by name, but everyone in the industry knew the story, and my speech was really about how his failure had created an opportunity to build something better. The Workers' Safety Committee we'd established had become a model that other plants were copying, and 3 employees had taken advantage of the safety training scholarships to begin their own careers in occupational health and safety. Looking back, getting fired was the best thing that could have happened because it freed me to do what I knew was right without worrying about political consequences or protecting my job. Richard thought he could silence me by taking away my position, but what he actually did was create an enemy with nothing to lose, comprehensive documentation of his failures, and the moral authority of someone who'd been proven right at great personal cost. The revenge wasn't about destroying him personally, though that happened as a natural consequence of his own actions. The real revenge was proving that safety matters, that workers' lives have value that transcends quarterly production targets, and that people who try to intimidate others into silence will eventually face a reckoning they can't spin, deny, or escape. I built my career back stronger than ever, protected hundreds of workers from the kind of dangers Richard had normalized, and changed an entire corporate culture from one that tolerated risk to one that eliminated it. That's the kind of workplace revenge that doesn't just feel good in the moment, it creates lasting positive change that echoes through an organization for years, ensuring that the person who wronged you becomes a cautionary tale rather than a success story, while you become the example of what integrity and persistence can achieve when you refuse to compromise on what matters most. The final piece of vindication came 2 years later when I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining workplace safety enforcement and whistleblower protections. I sat in that hearing room in Washington, telling my story to lawmakers who were drafting legislation to strengthen protections for safety professionals and workers who report violations. My experience at Meridian became a case study in their report, an example of why retaliation against safety officers creates systemic risks that extend far beyond individual companies. Richard's name appeared in the congressional record as an example of negligent management, permanently documented in federal archives for anyone to see. Meanwhile, the legislation that passed partly because of my testimony made it significantly harder for future Richards to silence safety professionals, creating federal protections and substantial penalties for retaliation. I still work at Meridian, but now I also travel the country speaking at safety conferences, consulting with other companies, and mentoring young safety professionals who face the same pressures I did. Every time I tell my story, I see recognition in people's eyes, that moment when they realize they're not alone in fighting for what's right against leadership that prioritizes profit over people. Some of them reach out months or years later to tell me they stood their ground because they remembered what happened to me, that they documented everything and refused to be intimidated, and that their vigilance prevented disasters that would have destroyed lives and companies alike. That's when I know the revenge was complete, not because one man lost his career, but because his failure to silence me created a ripple effect that protected countless workers hell never meet and prevented tragedies that will never make headlines precisely because they never happened. Richard tried to erase me from the story of that plant, but instead he made me the hero of a much bigger story about integrity, accountability, and the courage to do what's right even when it costs you everything. He wanted to be remembered as the manager who boosted production numbers, but instead he'll forever be the cautionary tale about what happens when ambition overrides ethics. I wanted to be remembered as someone who protected workers and built safety cultures, and by firing me for doing exactly that, Richard gave me a platform and a purpose bigger than anything I could have achieved if he'd just left me alone. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do to someone, it's becoming living proof that their worst decision created something far more powerful than they ever could have imagined, and knowing that every life you save and every worker who goes home safely is a testament to why they were wrong and you were right.